Good evening, everybody. My name is Heather Hughes. I am the president of the EIS. I want to warmly welcome you to the first webinar in the EIS Climate Education Series. We're really grateful that you've made the time to come along this evening, and we're really delighted that we have three excellent speakers joining us who will share their work and thoughts with us. We're broadcasting this webinar live on Facebook and tweeting from it. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag EIS webinars. Our chat box is also open for you to share any questions with our speakers. If we get loads and loads, we'll select some and put these to the speakers at the end of the event. Before I introduce the first speaker, I just want to let you know that the EIS is carrying out lots of work in the run-up to and beyond COP26. You can find details of all this work, including where to sign up to future EIS webinars, on the EIS webpage, which is www.eis.org.uk/climate change. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the first in a series of environmental webinars where we will look at the changes needed to our economy, infrastructure, and our daily lives to support the move to a greener and healthier society. Our first speaker tonight is Jimmy Paul. Jimmy is the director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland, which is working to deliver social justice on a healthy planet. Jimmy has been recognised for his leadership skills internationally and has worked in health and social care leadership roles for nearly 10 years, including at Scotland's Independent Care Review. With no more ado, I will now hand over to you, Jimmy Paul. Jimmy, you are very welcome.
Heather, thank you very much. If you could stay off mute just as I share my screen and confirm that you can see it all fine.
Yes, we can see that well. Thank you, Jimmy.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'll just go into presentation mode then. There we go. Thank you very much for a lovely introduction. Guys, I'm delighted to be here this evening and spend the next hour and a half or so with you guys. So I'm here to talk about the wellbeing economy and its role in delivering climate change and how that might be relevant to you. So the current story is this, that we take the long road option with regards to our economy. We get the economy to grow bigger, but don't fret too much about the damage to people or the environment that this does. The next step is we sequester a chunk via taxation, and then we channel some of this money to help people and the planet cope with step number one. But this really doesn't take account of every message that we are hearing from every scientist all over the globe about how we are now in a code red situation for humanity. We are living in a hotter, drier, more hostile planet. There are more floods than ever before. The place where I grew up in Barking in East London had its first ever tornado just this summer. The droughts we've seen, and we know that this is getting worse. So this is failure demand. This is putting a sticking plaster over the damage that we cause because we don't get things right in the first place. And we know that it's a relatively small minority that are responsible for the majority of the emissions. And we also know that those who are poorest, living in the poorest countries or living in Scotland, who are the poorest, will be those that are impacted most by climate change. They will be in the path of the floods. They will be the ones who can't move away when the drought hits. And so climate change is a social justice issue. Climate change and social justice are two sides of the same coin. And our economic system is a contributing factor to this. It is a part of this. So instead, we say that we can build a wellbeing economy which is in essence about delivering social justice on a healthy planet. It is about a significant repurposing of the economy so that it is in service of people and planet and not solely extractive from people and planet. And I'll expand on this throughout the next few slides. It's hard to go better than Kirsty Flanagan's explanation on this from Linwood Community Development Trust. So what does the wellbeing economy really mean? It is when you're able to develop assets that meet the real needs of our communities. It's being a single mum asking for space to support families and young people with addiction and mental health issues. It's about equality, it's about respect, about empowerment, ownership and trust. And she gives an example of some of the work in the area Linwood, where she's worked, where young people have been going up to teachers, those who own sports centres, and saying, can we have the keys to the football pitch because we feel that this is our football pitch, and those absolutely obliging. So how do we build an economy which is in service of what people and planet need, and which addresses the challenges of climate change, which I know is the feature of today's webinar? So we've started to talk about the 4 Ps: purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and being people-powered. So purpose. We need to be fair. We're the friends of GDP growth and not its ever-faithful followers. And what I mean by that is we need to understand that there are limitations to what GDP growth means in terms of the well-being of our communities, of our nation. GDP growth was created nearly 90 years ago by a group of men who came together, most of which were quite wealthy, and said, this is how we measure the success of our nation from now on. And even then, they acknowledged the limitations of growth. They were aware. And maybe it served a purpose for some time in the 20th century, but it's not fit for the 21st century. So that means understanding the difference between ends and means. And it means paying attention to the direction and composition of growth, not just its rate. So when we see all of these news articles and people speaking on TV, when they say, fantastic news, 3% growth in the past quarter, what does that mean for those that really need to experience growth more than others? Sorry if you can hear baby Finley speaking in the background, 10-month-old, he loves interrupting these sessions. So there are parts of Glasgow, your Drum Chapels, your Mary Hills, many other parts of Glasgow, parts of Edinburgh, parts of Aberdeen, Inverness, that absolutely need to experience GDP growth. But there are other parts that are doing absolutely fine and are saturated, and perhaps it's more about how we share and distribute that growth equitably. Prevention, looking upstream. So as the introduction that was kindly mentioned for me stated, I used to work at the Independent Care Review. I was a co-chair for the workforce work stream, and the Care Review is the world's first root and branch review of a care system, so children's care. And I'm happy and comfortable sharing that I grew up in the care system from the age of 11. And before that, I grew up in extremely harsh poverty in East London, the poorest borough of East London. And prevention is so key. And there's so much more that we could do by looking and acting upstream. And we surfaced this at the Care Review, and we used a human and economic cost model to detail just how much money we could save by investing upstream and not indulging in failure demand in Scotland's care system. And that's just one example. You can think about exactly the same, of course, for climate change. And I'll talk a bit about Cambo and the recent talk of Cambo later in this presentation. So how can we think and act upstream in a way that is preventative, in a way that not only is sensible and preventative, but morally the right thing to do, making the economic case for the moral argument? Pre-distribution, getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. Now, pre-distribution is maybe not the nicest word, but what it means is, what are the rules that are in place in the economy that are making sure that we are not having silly discussions about £20 cuts to those who are worst off in society as a justification for apparently helping to build the economy back in COVID recovery? How are we thinking about taxation and progressive taxation and the right incentives to ensure that universal services are benefited by all and received by all? And people powered, if I had to choose a favourite P, it would probably be this one. Again, going back to the Care Review, going back to some of the work I did in health and social care, when change is led by people themselves that are impacted by change, it is much more likely to be effective and sustained and impactful. And at the Care Review, we heard from nearly 6,000 people across 3 years, of which more than half had personal experience of the care system. And the care community had wide-ranging support for the care review's recommendations. This then built cross-party political support for those recommendations. Myron Rogers is a systems theorist, and he often says, the process you use to get to the future is the future you get. And that is why it is so important that we involve people in the change that we're delivering. That approach of nothing about us without us. And that certainly stands true when thinking about climate change and those most impacted by it. William Beveridge said, a revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. And we're at that point just now. We've acknowledged that the previous economic system, the obsession with GDP, is limited and maybe served a bit of a purpose in the 20th century, but can't in the 21st. And we've got a potential new way to design the economy which doesn't contribute so damn significantly to climate change. So how is this relevant? And I've spelled some of this out already. Our current system is extractive by design. We are overshooting our boundaries, and this is a nod to Kate Raworth's work on donut economics. And if you've not read her book, Donut Economics, I highly recommend you do. She talks about the planetary boundaries and those of which we are transgressing, those of which we are undershooting. And she talks about the need to live, if you think of an American style ring donut, we need to live within that donut. If we overshoot, we're damaging the planet. If we undershoot, people are not flourishing. The proliferation of pseudo-satisfiers, that's a horrible phrase, isn't it? But I'll tell you what I mean by it. If you look at some of the adverts that are on TV at the moment, you know, Ray-Bans are telling us if you buy 2 pairs of Ray-Bans, you'll be happy. If you go get a massage or a manicure, that will keep you happy. If you buy this fancy new car, that will keep you happy. But and you as EIS, as trade union folk working in education, everyone in this session will understand that actually there are higher order goals which are more important. And I'll come on to talk about these again later in this presentation. What about a sense of purpose? What about a sense of meaning in life? What about a sense of belonging and the structures around you in work or at home or in community and society that enable you to feel that? But of course, the pseudo-satisfiers is, it's an attempt to get you to consume more, which results in us overshooting our boundaries and reflects the fact that we are extracted by design. How about innovation? So we talk about innovation, and one example I've got to say is H&M, who talk about innovating, releasing a new clothing line every 2 weeks. That for me is false innovation. It's about extraction and consuming, and it's not about socially significant innovation that's going to make a real difference to people's lives aside from consumption. So how can we think about socially significant innovation and invest, put the wind into the sails of that? I mentioned Cambo earlier. Isn't it interesting that we're still entertaining the idea of Cambo, opening a new oil field, despite all of the targets, the very difficult and challenging targets we've got around achieving net zero? There seems to be an incongruence between what the policy is and the policy direction and actually the actions of us right now, and we're not thinking long term by design. I mentioned earlier about prevention and pre-distribution, and there's not enough of that in our budgeting. We'd like to see much more of that. And of course, there's not enough support for businesses, social enterprises, charities, community interest companies, etc. And we've heard from, so we have allies who are our members, and lots of our allies have said to us, especially those that are social enterprises and community interest companies, we want to be super conscious of our emissions, our contribution to climate change, reducing that, making a difference, setting an example for others. But it's really hard in the outset to be so conscious of that when actually you need to survive, first of all, and the incentives that are out there are not quite strong enough for organisations who are just setting up. So what are some of the things that trade unions can do? Going from top left to right, get behind a wellbeing economy. You can become members of WEAL. Anyone watching this, if you're part of an organisation, you can join WEAL. It's free to do. You become part of a wider network, a wider group. And not only will that encourage you to play your part and be supported and challenged by others, we can be and will be a collective voice around all of these pertinent issues that we're talking about today. As well as that, you can help end precarious work and people experiencing work as just-in-time inventory, as if people are robots, and that is not in service of those higher order goals I spoke about earlier. You can amplify the voices of your members, shift the power base. I spoke earlier about the care review and listening to those with care experience and change being driven by those of us with care experience. At every level of the care review, at least 50% of us had personal experience of the care system. So how are you guys shifting that power base to make sure that those you exist to serve are truly being heard? And I like the analogy of giving someone a megaphone and amplifying their voice by giving them a megaphone, making sure they're being heard in all the right forums for change to be, to influence change. Support purpose-driven organisations. What can you do to add wind in the sails of those purpose-driven organisations? It might be writing blogs, it might be connecting them with other organisations, it might just be giving them some funding if that's available based on your role, but what can you do to support that? Network opportunities I spoke about in becoming a member of WHEEL, but there'll be plenty of other organisations bringing together like-minded folk to make a difference. Explore governance structures of work. Are we involving those with lived experience in these as well? So just hammering home that point. Be proactive about a just transition. New investment is required and substantial retraining is required to support that just transition. And I'm interested in what role you guys can play to support that. Advocate for incentivizing long-term investment over short-term gains. So what are you doing to think long-term? And how are you applying that message to those that you work with and support? And think about things like living wages, universal services, progressive taxation, and what voice you can have in amplifying for that. And there'll be many, many other things. This is me just pulling together a few suggestions, but this is me having not worked in the field that you work in. You guys are the ones that are the experts and can come up with more solutions. And I'm sure at the end of this session today, all of our speeches, you will have many more ideas. And I'm looking forward to hearing those in the future. So you have the answers. Another question that was posed to me as I was pulling together this presentation is, what can we do as individuals? So we all, if you're an organisation, you can join as an ally. If you want to join as an individual, you can join as a citizen. We have a citizens platform, again, collective voice, learning opportunities, collective opportunities. There's people that come and do special guest talks. And I'll talk more about WHEEL as I close the presentation in a few slides' time. Of course, reflect on how you vote, reflect on your lifestyle choices. Build hope, though, that's the point I want to make. In your actions, whether it's you embodying that change or whether that is understanding that human innovation got us into the challenges that we face today, and it is that human innovation that can get us out of these challenges as well. And if you're embodying and sharing that message, then more people are likely to take an action. I was quite struck speaking to an environmental consultant, because by the way, I'm not an economist. I'm delighted to be the director of WHEEL Scotland for lots of reasons. I'm 31, I'm a mixed race care leaver from East London. And the reason I share that with you so openly is because I feel safe and happy to do so, first of all. I think it's important to say. But second of all, it's not usually people like me that assume spaces of directors of organisations, and certainly not without being an economist for an organisation like WHEEL Scotland. So I'm delighted to be able to contribute to this work and this mission and bring a different angle and lens. And each of you will do exactly that as well, whatever your experience, expertise, viewpoints. So don't be put off because you're not an economist. I certainly feel imposter syndrome at times, and I need to work through that, but I can see that I'm contributing something original. And to that point, I think it's important. This environmental consultant that was talking to me explained how the phrase carbon footprint actually came from the oil industry, who wanted to push a sense of individual responsibility onto people. So if people are being more lifestyle conscious, the oil industry needed to do less. And that actually, quite frankly, disgusts me. And I would not want anyone taking that message away from today. I still think there's lots we can do to build hope and make a difference in our lives. But of course, the bulk of that change needs to come from big industry, those big organisations that I referenced earlier in the second slide. We just need to make sure that we're playing our part, yes, but collectively advocating for wider systems change. So where are we at just now? So the Scottish Government have ambitious commitments to transition to a net zero emissions for Scotland by 2045. They want to be at net zero for all greenhouse gases. That's fantastic, but of course when we're entertaining talk of Cambo, that can feel a little bit like we're not taking all of the right actions, for example, along that path. But there are absolutely reasons to be optimistic. Scotland is one of 6 wellbeing economy government nations. It was actually the founding and convening nation. And what that means is it's a nation that's committed to delivering a wellbeing economy, which is in service of people and planet. And I can't wait for there to be another one that joins. So instead of the G7, we can be the We 7, a nice alternative, because the G7, the entry ticket to the G7 is GDP. And I've just explained some of the limitations of GDP, whereas the We 7 would be and build an economy for each of those nations which is fit for the 21st century. So it's really exciting that Scotland is the founding, convening nation for the We Go nations. You'll all be aware that COP26 is taking place in Glasgow in just a few weeks' time, and that could provide to be a landmark moment with ambitious goals being set, renewed commitment, renewed energy, and an understanding that, again, the innovation that got us into the challenges we face today can be met. Those challenges can be met by the innovation of people again. There is a 10-year plan for economic transformation, and that starts in November. There was a consultation period over summer, and that was 8 weeks long. And in the next few weeks, we're going to get some sort of draft strategy from an economic transformation group that are overseeing this. And essentially, this will deliver a wellbeing economy in 10 years. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what that plan looks like and offering all of our support and, of course, all of our challenge to what that strategy looks like as well. I think it's important. I spoke earlier about people-powered and participation. Actually, a 6-8 week consultation period over summer during parliamentary recess is maybe not the best way to involve people that are going to be most impacted by change. And I would say that we need to make sure that we are reaching those, and I hate the phrase hard to reach, but voices and people that have been marginalised by our systems, making sure that we are finding ways to meaningfully involve those people, because those are the ones that are going to be most impacted by this 10-year plan. There's a cross-party group, CPG, on a wellbeing economy, which We All Scotland and I am the secretariat for. So I'm delighted to say that we've got membership from all of the parties in Scotland. It's brilliant. It's necessary to have that cross-party support. We had it at the Independent Care Review, and it really helped when different parties were vying to be more ambitious with implementation rather than trying to shoot each other's ideas and implementation ideas down. So we're building that cross-party support at We All. Lots of it already exists, but it's just getting people to understand what actually a wellbeing economy means, as I've explained to you today, because I still think, you know, as an organisation, by the way, it's just me at We All Scotland until next week when I finally get a colleague recruited into post, but we've punched above our weight in terms of our impact. Being invited to meetings like this is case in point. It's fantastic we get to come and speak to you about this and share our learning and to hear from you later on as well. I can't wait to hear from you all. But the next step really is building that cross-party support. The work of Net Zero on a circular economy, Net Zero Waste Scotland, making sure that we are reusing, we're thinking circular in our design, not extracted by our design. And there's lots of good examples from Net Zero and Net Zero Waste Scotland on that. We have a wellbeing framework in the form of a national performance framework, and that's huge in Scotland as well, hugely important. And we can build on that and understand some of the things that we can measure. So I've offered some challenge to GDP, and Catherine Trebeck, the founder of We All, the writer of The Arrival of Economics, she's just a brilliant speaker, a brilliant writer. And if you haven't read her book, I would highly recommend as well, a second book recommendation today. And she talks about girls riding bikes to school. Now that would be a fantastic measure of the community well-being in a small community, in a town or in a city, because what that would mean is families can afford bikes, girls feel safe and are safe riding to school, the infrastructure is right, the roads are safe, schools have the infrastructure to store plenty of bikes, and that we're having less cars on the road. And that's just a few examples. And it's really important to build, and that might be an example of what we call a cornerstone indicator. It's important to work in participatory ways to build cornerstone indicators by working with people. And at We All, we're optimistic that we can bulk out these national performance framework measures with other cornerstone indicators that feed into them. And of course, we've got the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals. They're a helpful guide as well. So another reason to be optimistic. Increasing support for pro-social business models, and Scotland's got quite a long history of this as well. Social enterprises, community interest companies, we've got Cooperatives Development Scotland and Social Enterprise Scotland doing some really fantastic work, adding wind to the sails of pro-social business models and those that are embodying them. I spoke about the independent care review a couple of times today. And again, a third recommendation for reading, have a look at the reports from the independent care review. It could provide a really fantastic template for shifting the power base away from those that have held power traditionally to those that should be heard much more than they have been. And I loved how Fiona Duncan, the chair of the review, and is now the chair of the oversight body of the Promise, which fell on from the review, said, I am not accountable to Nicola Sturgeon, any politician or chief executive. I am accountable to people across Scotland, children across Scotland, and particularly those with care experience. And that accountability piece is really important. And if more people follow her lead in terms of accountability and driving change and honouring care experience and thinking preventatively, thinking pre-distributively in terms of the output, we'll see a much better Scotland, and one that is much more impactful at achieving not only its climate change goals, but also the social justice element I spoke about. At Wheels Scotland, we're releasing a report just next month, which makes the economic case for the moral case, and it's called the Failure Demand Report. And I'll be sure to share that with the EIS once that comes out. And that looks at Scotland and it looks at Alberta in Canada. It's almost a comparison between the two. And it looks at what we're doing in terms of failure demand expenditure around climate action. And it will prove, using Scotland's statistics and data, that we are spending nearly £1 billion every year in failure demand around climate and climate action. So keep an eye out for that report, because you will love to read that, and it will, again, make the economic case for the moral argument. And all of the above actions acknowledge that the economy is inextricably linked to climate action. So that is me. I think I'm a bit ahead of time, which is good. We've made up some time. It's been great to speak to you all. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and hearing the other fantastic speakers following on.
Thank you very much for that, Jimmy. It was an excellent presentation, and indeed a thought-provoking presentation as well. Can I just remind our viewers that the chat box is open should you wish to submit any questions. We'll gather these at the end and put them to our speakers. I'm going to keep things moving, and I'm now going to hand over to our second speaker, who is Stephen Smiley. Stephen Smiley is the Deputy Convener of Unison Scotland and the trade union rep on the COP26 Coalition Coordinating Group. For those of you that aren't aware of the COP26 Coalition, their work looks to create solidarity amongst all struggles and groups that will be most impacted by climate change to demand a safer world for all under climate change. Central to this working is working with trade unions and demanding a just transition. Over to you, Stephen. You're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here. I see my old mentor, Bill Ramsey, was joining us earlier on. I don't know if he's still there. Bill taught me everything he knows. That didn't take very long, mind you, but we worked very close together in South Lanarkshire over many, many years. So nice to bump into him again. So thanks very much for the invite. I will talk about COP26, what it is, and what the coalition is doing for it, or planning for it. But first of all, I want to, when I do this kind of talk, I like to remind myself that a number of years ago, I couldn't get MD in my union to talk about climate change. It was not important. Well, that's all very well and good, but there's something much more important, whether that's whatever the latest pay campaign or the cuts campaign or whatever it is, was more of a priority. It's really, really encouraging now that unions, almost all unions certainly, are doing these sorts of things, having these kind of discussions and talking it through, because the more we as workers talk about it, the more we understand about it, the more likely it is that we'll be able to come up with solutions. to the problem. Climate change is a union issue. It wasn't always seen that way. There was discussions a number of years ago in the STUC forums where there was a particular camp who basically just denied, we don't want, we don't have time to talk about that. It's about protecting jobs, our jobs, not jobs and future jobs, but our jobs, the ones we've got just now. We don't see any prospect of them changing. And therefore, when we suggested that we should invite some of the environmental campaigners to come and join some of our discussions about the future of energy, we were told that we don't need those tree huggers to come and tell us how to run our industry. And as Jimmy was pointing out, a lot of our industries are based on a very extractive and exploitative model, which has been part of the problem. So we as trade unions had to face up to that. It's a trade union issue because, first of all, union members aren't just union members, they're citizens, they're parents, they're grandparents, and anybody who looks at anything to do with climate change, they will know that the impact that climate change will have on us if we don't stop the temperature rises, it will be catastrophic. It's when I was introduced at a meeting the other day, somebody who'd been involved in this for decades and decades, which was probably a slight exaggeration, but it made me feel very old. But we used to talk about this in terms of, yeah, it'll be our children's children, or it'll be terrible for them. But actually, climate change is happening now. You just look at the fires in Australia and North America, the floods in Germany and Belgium this year. This is happening now. It's happening in Scotland just now as well. Less dramatic, I suppose, in some sense, but we have experienced more severe weather events in the past few years than many of us can remember when we were growing up. So it's with us just now. So as citizens, the parents and grandparents, we need to reflect the concerns of our members in terms of climate change. But it's also going to impact us as workers. Those of you who work in schools, particularly new schools, over the past few years will realise that the buildings that we've designed are not going to be fit for purpose for much longer. The temperatures that we have to work in are frightening, sometimes the air quality. And of course, with COVID coming along, that's just been emphasised a great deal. The severe weather events means that, for Unison, we've got workers trying to get to people's houses to deliver care in extreme weather conditions. Floods and snow and all the rest of it. We've got workers who work outside all the time in very hot temperatures who we've had to negotiate that they all get proper sunshades and sun creams and stuff like that to protect them. So there's all those kind of impacts that will have on us as workers, and of course it'll impact on the services that we deliver, because public services, councils, governments are going to have to pay a lot of money for the adaptation to cope with climate change. We're going to have to build greater river defences and coastal defences. We're going to have to change the way the buildings. We're going to have to repair the damage to the infrastructure that all these storms and stuff like that produce. And if you have to invest your money in that, you'll have less money to invest in providing services to the people in the community, to kids in schools, to older people in health service and so on and so forth. So climate change is happening now, and we who work in public services, unfortunately, are part of the problem, because it takes an awful lot of energy to run schools or swimming baths or hospitals, and we're going to have to do something about that. We, Unison, are currently doing some research into just how do we decarbonise the public sector, and I haven't seen the results of the research, but it's going to cost a lot of money. We're going to have to talk about investment, and that investment is not going to come from anywhere except from the state. The private sector are not going to deliver on this. And that brings us to what our purpose, our role in all of this as trade unions is. Now, we can get involved in the political campaigning, which we do, and we hope you, in terms of the COP coming up, we will get involved in that. But also as trade unions, what we do on a daily basis is we negotiate with the employers, and we bargain for improvements. We need to start developing a bargain agenda which reflects the threats that climate change are bringing to us. And that's a challenge for us, because it's not always simple, it's not always easy, and there's that competing sense of priorities. What is the priority in our negotiating table? But climate change has to feature in it. COP26 is coming up, and I just want to spend a little bit of time explaining what COP26 is and what it might not be. So I'm sharing my screen now. So I think I'm sharing my screen. Hold on. I think, is that me sharing the screen? Yes, right. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Heather. And it should be on the presentation, but yes, that's it. Okay. So the UN Climate Change Conference is obviously taking place in Glasgow in November. It was supposed to be last November, as I think most people know. It was postponed due to COVID. We're doing it in partnership. UK is leading this or organising this in partnership with Italy. This is the way they do it. They have two partners. That's why in Milan just now, you may have seen the coverage of the youth conference that has been taking place, which will be followed by a United Nations meeting. And this is their preparation for what the discussions are going to be in Glasgow. And you'll have seen on the news Greta Thunberg laying down the law, as only she can do, explaining that we've had enough of the blah, 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 as she said. We need action. And that fundamentally is absolutely the case. So what is COP? COP is Conference of the Parties. It's a bit archaic language, but that's what it is. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was created in 1992. And every year since then, we've had a conference of the parties to that convention. The parties are the governments who have signed up to it. 1992, that's when that was. That's 30 years ago. That means it's 30 years ago, the governments of this world understood the need to take action to prevent climate change or to prevent the dangerous anthropogenic human-induced interference with the climate system. 30 years ago, the governments of this world knew that what we were doing in our industry and a human impact on the planet was going to cause it to lead to climate change. 30 years. So for 30 years, they've failed to actually do anything about it. And this is the 26th COP, hence it's COP26. That means there's been 25 COPs before it who've all failed to actually come up with the answers. And I think that's an important point to remind ourselves of. In the Paris COP, I was privileged to go over to Paris COP, and there was 1.5 million people on the streets of Paris. It was wonderful. And when they announced it was coming to Glasgow, I thought it'd be brilliant, 1 million people marching through Glasgow. Fantastic. And then COP came along, and of course that would be silly to even suggest that we should try and cram 1 million people into Glasgow. But the COP, the Paris Agreement was a real step forward. They agreed that they had to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees and try to limit the increase to 1.5 by the middle of the 21st century. They recognised if they didn't, the consequences would be catastrophic for the climate. They agreed the second aim was to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse changes of climate change, foster climate resilience, and develop, development. Jimmy talked about the kind of development that we've been used to, which destroys the planet. So it's a recognition that we need to find ways to develop a planet which don't develop economies that don't destroy the planet and don't threaten food production. And the third aim was to make finance flows consistent with moving towards low greenhouse gas emissions. That was the aims. The provisions within it, and this is where the grand talk, the blah blah blah, comes into to a certain extent. So what they agreed is that we'd all have nationally determined contributions. So we all agreed that we should try and reduce carbon emissions, and we have to keep the temperature rise to below no more than 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. We agreed that. And we then agreed as governments that we would all go away and come up with our own nationally determined contributions. So Britain will decide what it's going to do, and France will decide what it's going to do, and Malawi will decide what it's going to do. And of course, the flaw in that, of course, is what happens if what they decide to do isn't enough? Well, I don't worry about that, because we'll have a global stock take every 5 years. Next one, the first one, or next one's due in 2023. And the idea is that we'll check how we're going, and we'll increase our ambitions every 5 years. But all this is voluntary, it's all non-binding, and so far it's not produced the goods, because of all the nationally determined contributions, and they haven't all produced them, all the countries, all the parties have not yet produced their own NDCs. None of them really come up to the mark with any analysis that's done of them. We talked about having sustainable development mechanisms without necessarily defining what that would be. We talked about, in terms of adaptation, how we cope with climate change, of finding $100 billion by 2020 to aid developing countries, because Britain Britain primarily, if you like, leading the Industrial Revolution, we've had 200 odd years where we have enjoyed the fruits of fossil fuel economy. Sorry. The Global South haven't enjoyed the fruits of that at all, and yet they're the ones who are suffering the most at the moment through the impact of rising sea levels and desertification of their agricultural land. And the idea was that we would find all this money to give them to help with that. And of course, Boris Johnson was in New York, I think last week, lecturing people about, we need to step up that, we need to find this money, which is rich given the cuts to international aid that the current government have put through. Because we didn't find £100 billion by last year, and we still haven't found it for this year. And finally, we talked about, the agreement talked about mitigation, and their idea of how we mitigate that is to come up with a global carbon market. Now, as trade unionists, we recognise that market solutions haven't solved the problems of poverty or equality or educational attainment or pretty much anything, actually. So the idea that a market-based solution could solve the problems of climate change, we are a bit sceptical about. Because essentially what that means is we can continue emitting carbon, but we'll get somebody else to plant trees or some other similar, and we can trade these things off. So we don't really need to get to net zero, we just have to persuade somebody to do something else, and we can trade that off. That's not going to work. But that is the main item on the agenda at the COP26 in Glasgow. That's the unfinished business in Paris, because every COP since then has failed to work out how a carbon market would actually work, and they're still trying to do it, and that's what the main point of the Glasgow agenda is. Paris was also significant in that the trade unions, I should explain it, within the COP you've got the blue zone, and that's where all the governments meet up, and in the blue zone you have some major outside interests, so that's big corporate interests, but also squeezed in there's a few trade union representatives through the international TUC. So that our TUC and our, I think the Education International, for example, the Public Services International that Unison's aligned to, we're all part of that push. And the big push that we made at Paris was to try and get this concept of a just transition into the agreement. We got it into the preamble. We didn't get it into the agreement, but we got it in the preamble when it talks about, we should get a just transition should be part of what we're doing. The ITUC defines a just transition as such there, so I'll not read it all out. But essentially, if we're going to transition from a carbon-based economy to a low or a zero carbon economy, we need to make sure that we don't just throw overboard all of the workers in the communities that are based on fossil fuels and leave them to rot. We in Scotland went through a number of transitions. I'm from Lanarkshire. We done away with our coal mines a long time ago, but we left all the coal miners either to travel to England to get jobs or to go on the dole. When we transitioned away from a steel engineering economy, we suffered mass unemployment. And so these were unjust transitions. So the idea of a just transition is it needs to be fair for the workers. But one of the things that we need to recognise here, the just transition isn't just about getting work jobs for the oil workers in the North Sea, for example, or the gas workers who will no longer be producing gas because we'll be based on renewable energy and so on and so forth. It's not just about that. It's not just about retraining them and getting them decent jobs. It is about that, but it's not just about that. It is about transition to an economy which is a green economy, an economy which doesn't destroy the planet, that actually values the work that we do. And as educators or care workers, that we in our trade unions and our kind of public services, we are the kind of green jobs that we need more of in the future. We need more of that kind of stuff. And what the problem at the moment is, if you speak to an oil rig worker about what kind of job they could transition to, they are not really encouraged by the idea they could have a 0-hour contract in a call centre, or even a care worker getting paid the living wage if they're lucky. So we need to talk about how we transition the economy so that actually it moves to a different kind of economy where we value those kind of jobs. In Scotland, the STUC, along with a number of affiliates to the STUC, including Unison, along with Friends of Scotland, set up the Just Transition Partnership about 5 or 6 years ago. And one of the things we called upon was the Scottish Government to set up a Just Transition Commission to take forward this idea of a just transition in Scotland. They did. They set it up. It reported back in April, and they've just recently announced that they will, there will be a new Just Transition Commission, which will basically keep advising the Scottish Government on what a just transition. So everything in the programme of government for the Scottish Government will be checked, if you like, by this Just Transition Commission to say, is this going in the direction of a just transition? So similar to what Jimmy talked about, we're moving towards a well-being economy, where there is a commitment to this. Now, the report which the Just Transition Commission produced wasn't everything that we'd hoped it would be. We thought it was slightly unambitious and could do more, but nonetheless, it was certainly a step forward. And if the UK government could to replicate that, we might actually start seeing some progress. Anyway, that was a slight divergence away from COP26. Progress to date is not good. The intergovernmental I can remember what this stands for, intergovernmental platform, climate change, whatever it's called, IPCC report, their annual report, just published in August, basically said that unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the chances of limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees centigrade will be beyond reach. And that's what Greta was referring to when she said, we've had enough of the blah, 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 we need action. We're not doing enough and we're not doing it fast enough. So we've come along to COP26. So as I said, the main item for the United Nations negotiations is about how we can develop what they refer to as the cooperative approaches, which is primarily about carbon markets. The UK presidency, Alok Sharma MP, has said that they have 5 priority areas: adaptation and resilience, nature, energy transition, clean road transport, and finance. And you'll notice that just transition isn't one of their priority areas. And that, if you like, presents us with, that's what the challenge is for us, to try and get COP to be meaningful. Because if we leave Glasgow having come up with some kind of agreement on carbon markets and nothing else, it will have been a failure, another failure, and we'll be no any further forward. And we need to start as trade unions and those putting pressure on political parties. We need to try and get them to be a bit more ambitious. We need binding agreements that actually they have to do. They have to achieve targets, and they have to do them within the next 5 to 10 years. They can't. It's not about waiting to 2050. The idea of what needs to be in place by 2050, the steps to get there have to be in place in the next few years. Otherwise, we'll never meet them. We need to ensure that just transition is part of that. Just transition for our economy and for the workers directly involved. So the COP26 coalition came together 2 years ago now to start planning about how we as a civic society can try and influence this. So it's involved various different trade unions, environmental groups and others, faith groups. And what you have there is the poster. Hopefully you'll see many more copies of it. This is Lady Justice holding up a dandelion. And the concept behind this is a dandelion has very, very deep roots, and that's what we need to achieve in order to make this. It's also apparently, you get dandelions in every continent in the world, so it's a universally recognised flower. I know very much about them because they're in my garden constantly. I keep trying to get rid of them, but maybe I should treasure them a bit more. And of course, they let off all these seeds, and that's the idea of all these ideas getting seeded in the community. So that's the poster that the coalition has adopted, calling for a number of things, but calling for the Global Day for Climate Justice on November the 6th, and I'll say a wee bit more about that in a minute. But the fortnight that we spend in Glasgow, and of course, as I said, there won't be the 1.5 million people descending in Glasgow as there might have been in other COPs. There'll be 197 governments, or 198, whatever the current number of the parties is. There'll be far fewer people from the Global South, and that's one of the issues, that this is probably the least accessible COP we've ever had. So part of what we're trying to do is try to ensure that the voices of people from the Global South are heard. So we'll have a number of activities going on throughout the fortnight, but particularly we'll have days of action, starting on the 5th, which is a school student strike, a global school student strike on the Friday. And then on the 6th of November, the Saturday, there's the Global Day of Action. We organise demonstrations in Glasgow, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, Brighton, Portsmouth, Cardiff, and probably various other places. So instead of one big demonstration in Glasgow, we are mobilising across the UK. And we obviously in Scotland, we hope people can come to Glasgow to take part in that. We'll also have what we're referring to as a People Summit from the Sunday through to the Wednesday, where there'll be a whole series of sessions, discussions, arguments, seminars, speeches, and all the rest of it taking place. And every day we will have an assembly, a movement assemblies, where we'll find out what's going on in the blue zone, what the governments are talking about, and how we need to try and react to that and spread the word. Our People Summit is involved all those kind of climate justice working groups. But this is the planning process that we're going through that we'll be publicising soon, and hopefully you can participate in them either directly by being in Glasgow or online through these kind of platforms that we're all now used to. Those are the other events taking place on the Monday, the 8th. As part of the summit, we will have a Just Transition Hub, where we'll have a day of international speakers talking about what just transition means, both for the workers in the fossil fuel industries, but also for the economies that we all depend upon. So that's what the coalition is planning over the next period. I'm really pleased that EIS are supporting that and will be organising people to come along to it. And there's a number of meetings coming up over the next couple of weeks to help prepare for that. And if anybody wishes to come along to our trade union caucus, for example, next Tuesday, I'll try and find the link and put it in the chat so people can do that, where it'll be a list of international speakers. So I'm going to wind up there, Heather, and thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy to try and answer questions later on. So cheers.
Thank you, Stephen. That was another excellent presentation. I know I learned a lot, and you explained really well what the COP26 coalition are doing for us. So we're keeping really well to our timings. So I'm about to hand over to our final speaker this evening, who is Fraser Stewart. Originally from a council estate in Forfar, Fraser is an applied public policy researcher at the University of Strathclyde, making clean energy and climate change work actively against poverty and inequality. He also sits on the board of Glasgow Community Energy and works extensively on climate and justice issues, both in media and in his local area. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight, Fraser, and I'll hand over to you now. You're very welcome, Fraser.
Oh, thanks very much for having us. Honestly, I appreciate it a lot, and it's a privilege to be able to sit alongside Jimmy and Stephen as well, who are talking about stuff that's massive, it's important, very difficult talks to follow, but I hope everyone took something from that because it really was brilliant. So yes, before I get into my talk, which will take us up to, I'll leave about 10 minutes or so at the end for questions. I've given a version of this talk. I've given loads of versions of this talk over the last 6 months or so, and they always go down well, and it's always very constructive. I have fun, the audience has fun, it's interactive, it's great. But before I give it, I've honed it to giving these 3 caveats beforehand. The first one is that I'm talking a lot about inequality. I'm talking about sort of justice, representation, but I'm talking purely to my experience here, right? I'm talking very much as a guy who grew up working class, grew up in poverty, grew up rough in a scheme in Scotland. That isn't to talk over anyone else's experience. That's not meant to be me speaking on behalf of anyone. There are a whole load of different overlapping experiences and inequalities and issues at play here in Scotland, the UK, but around the world in general too. I'm speaking only to my experience as someone who works in energy and climate in Scotland and the UK. The second thing is that everything I say it with love. It might seem a little bit personal sometimes. It might seem a little bit sort of critical sometimes, but I promise it's meant to be constructive, and it's coming from a place of wanting things to be better. The third and final thing, the last caveat, is that I swear. I use swear words. Some of them will slip out. It's just the way I talk. Apologies in advance if that's an issue to anyone. So let's get into it, because I know it's late in the evening and we're all dying to get our tea. So hello, yes, I'm Fraser and I'm a researcher and activist at the University of Strathclyde, although I'm originally from various rough and ready housing schemes in Forfar, just outside of Dundee there. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about representation, inequality and climate in Scotland. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the need for more inclusive climate action overall, how that can lead to a fair and even prosperous transition for people and communities across the country, and how educators and trade unionists can help to make that happen. Before that, though, I'm going to tell you a wee bit about myself and what I do, because I think it's helpful context. But I'll try not to take up too much of your time on that stuff. So again, I'm Fraser. I'm an energy policy researcher at the University of Strathclyde. My work looks at how we can make clean energy and other low carbon technology innovations work actively against poverty and inequality. So how can we make things like renewables work to bring money and jobs into areas of high deprivation? How can we make household solar panels or retrofit schemes work to reduce energy bills for low income families? How do we create a clean, expansive public transport network that reduces emissions, but also better connects excluded communities? That sort of thing, you get the gist. Outside of this research, like Heather mentioned, I also sit on the board of Glasgow Community Energy, which is a community energy cooperative based in Glasgow, bringing clean energy and its associated benefits to local areas and people across the city. As of earlier this year, Glasgow Community Energy have installed solar panels on 2 schools in Glasgow. Don't know if we've got any reps in tonight, but Glendale Primary in Pollock Shields and Ashton Secondary in Easterhouse. These panels generate clean electricity, which is used in the schools, but which also generates almost £10,000 per year per school in community benefit to fund local projects and initiatives. So that could be funding a community space or active travel, helping to reduce fuel poverty, any number of things, create a few wee jobs as well, any number of things. So that's me and that's what I do. And it really is, it's a privilege to get to do this type of work for a living, right? Working around the big issues of energy and climate more broadly. But see, being completely honest, right? While I obviously appreciate the urgency and the danger of the climate crisis, it's the single biggest fucking issue we face on the planet and care deeply about doing something about it. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself like a climate guy, first and foremost. I'm a poverty guy. I'm an inequality guy, a social justice guy. All these things are connected, of course, right? The climate for me then isn't just this big scary thing that we have to fix to save the planet and everyone and everything who lives here, although obviously it's a fucking massive scary thing that we have to fix to save the planet and everyone who lives here. But it's also a massive opportunity, right? We're at a formative moment in human history where we have to reimagine how we do pretty much everything to combat the climate emergency, right? Energy, housing, transport, heat, economics, industry, land, health, everything in between. All of these things have to change to combat the climate crisis. We can change those things in a way that makes life better for a whole load of people in the process, right? So we can retrofit lowest income houses, for instance, not just to make those houses healthier and warmer and more resilient to climate impacts, but to create a load of jobs and bring down energy bills for a lot of people who desperately need it as well. We can start community energy projects like the one I'm part of in Glasgow to generate clean energy and also create lots of social and economic benefits and promote power and ownership within communities in more ways than one, right? We can build that clean, expansive public transport service that not just reduces emissions and encourages people to leave the car at home, but that connects previously excluded communities to create better, more accessible leisure and employment opportunities, addressing those inequalities that are rooted into the fossil fuel infrastructure, right? So while I obviously appreciate that we need to combat the climate crisis on its own merit, this is what really gets me going, making the biggest issue we face in the world today, the climate emergency, work actively against social and economic injustice, which fundamentally, again, are interlinked and reinforcing. So this is what I do. And it's very much a passion driven by where and how I grew up, which I'm going to tell you a wee bit more about now, since everyone else has as well. Now, I promise I won't digress into a therapy session here, although I'm sure we could all fucking use one, given the state of the world. But I think it's useful to get across where I'm from so you can understand where I'm coming from and all of this. So, like I mentioned before, I'm from various rough and ready housing schemes in Forfar, just outside of Dundee. I don't know how many of you know Forfar at all, or if anyone's here from Forfar Academy, my old stomping ground. I love Forfar a bit. It's always home. But not all of it is that nice, right? My partner and I are both from Forfar. We met at school, and our folks always sort of joke about us being from 2 very different Forfars, right? They were from one of the nicer bits up on the hill in the north of the town. I'm very much from the rougher sort of schemes on the other side of the tracks. Anyway, that's where I'm from. And it was that kind of rough upbringing that we had in Forfar as well, right? My mum was a single parent who raised me and my brother pretty much single-handedly, which is no mean feat, given that we're both generally a pair of wee bastards most of the time. More than once we got dropped off together in the back of a Polis van, but that's a story for another time. I don't actually remember my mum only ever having one job out of pure necessity, right? God knows raising us was at least a full-time gig. But somehow she managed to drag us up through all of the issues with addiction, violence, financial insecurity, mental health, all the stuff that goes with living in pretty abject poverty. None of it was necessarily smooth, mind you, and we had a lot of issues, especially around school, actually. I was one of those classic, oh, Fraser's very smart, but I think he's fallen in with the wrong crowd. I was that kind of guy at school, right? Being honest, I was the wrong crowd. But that's how I was labelled, one way or another, for better or for worse. Whatever the reason, I'll get there, I promise I'll get there. Whatever the reason, at 16, before I could even sit my hires at the time, I was politely asked to leave school. By 17, I was on my first stint on the brew. Various twists and turns, made it back to Dundee College to get my hires onto a politics degree at Strathclyde, where I won a scholarship to do the work that I'm doing now. All of that, safe to say, it's been quite the transition, right? Not many wee bams from Forfar end up doing academic research or talking on the telly or the radio or at conferences and events like this about the climate crisis. More and more people everywhere these days are aware, and I know Stephen and Jimmy touched on this too, and concerned and see the issues with climate and the wider transition that we ultimately have to undertake. But folk from schemes like the one I'm from and loads of other underrepresented backgrounds are still very much in a minority when it comes to the wider climate conversation. And that's not exclusive to academia or research either, right? That's across policy, media, activism, industry, pretty much most of our climate spaces in Scotland and the UK. And I feel that a lot, right? Being from a rougher, I'm sure the other guys have run against this a few times too, being from that kind of background or being from a background not represented in these spaces make you feel really out of place a lot of the time. It makes me feel out of place all the time with climate stuff, and this is my fucking job on the day-to-day. So I've given all kinds of talks about this stuff recently. Just last month, I was in a meeting about the climate crisis with the Scottish Government. If you think you know what imposter syndrome feels like, try being a wee guy from Forfar having to apologise to a government minister for using the word shitebag in a conversation about COP26. And I promise that is a true story. Anyway, I'll get there. So these climate spaces don't always feel like they're for me as someone from that different kind of background. And within the context of the climate conversation in general, in Scotland and the UK, I think a lot of people feel the same way. And I think there's a big, obvious reason for that. I think the reason is that climate as a whole in Scotland and the UK still has a pretty stark class issue. Whether that's in policy and research, activism or media, the mainstream climate conversation is dominated, broadly speaking, by very well-meaning, very white, generally quite affluent and generally middle-class people and voices and concerns. And I think that's a problem. It's a problem for a couple of reasons, right? First, it's a problem because the climate crisis isn't just happening to middle-class people or more affluent groups who already care about the climate emergency and have some influence within it, right? It affects everyone, as Jimmy touched on earlier. It affects those, Stephen did as well, in fact, those lowest incomes, diverse working class, vulnerable, marginalised communities most acutely, especially women, especially people of colour, and especially people with disabilities. And this is true around the world, which is absolutely crucial to always keep in mind and always fight against. But it's also true right on our doorstep in Scotland, which I think we can overlook quite a lot of the time. So to call back to stuff that Jimmy and Stephen both touched on, a report from Climate Ready Clyde just the other month there found that 400,000 of the lowest income households in the Clyde area are most at risk of the sharp end of climate impacts. So those are the people most at risk of flooding, the folk who live in the worst quality housing, leading to adverse health impacts from extreme temperatures, the folk most exposed to the worst effects of air pollution, despite being least responsible for all those things, by the way. So we should be looking, and we really need to get more people from those communities into the fold on the climate crisis for that reason alone, because these are the people invariably feeling the sharpest effects. But beyond that, these solutions that we design to combat the climate crisis around things like energy, transport, housing, industry, all that good stuff, won't just affect the already concerned, already well-positioned middle classes either, right? So if we want to design solutions that address the inequalities at the heart of the climate crisis, to avoid leaving people or workers or communities behind, solutions that help us realise those big social and economic opportunities that we talked about at the start as well, which is where I'm sort of coming from, then we need to have many more voices from those backgrounds represented in the process and right alongside us as well. You cannot represent someone else's experience or interest from a distance. You can't really avoid harming working class, lower income, vulnerable groups and communities without having those voices central in the transition process. And you fundamentally cannot mobilise the critical mass of people that we need to really combat the climate crisis on the scale that the likes of Jimmy and we all talk about, with the already concerned around the table. So to make sure that the transition is fair, we need to get more people ultimately from those non-typical backgrounds into the fold. Now, none of this is to say that we need people in poverty, working class communities to suddenly try and do all the things that we're told repeatedly make our lives greener, right? Lowest income groups are barely responsible for a single fucking iota of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere. They aren't driving armoured tanks, they're not flying 20 times a year, they're not drilling for fossil fuels. And this speaks to a need to shift the conversation on individual action as well, but we don't have time to do it all this evening. What I'm saying then is that if we want a truly fair and even prosperous transition, then we need to do what we can to get more of those voices, underrepresented voices, into the conversation and along for the ride. As it stands, in my experience at least, it still feels for too many people from those types of communities that climate is the remit of experts and people who can afford to worry about it, because those are the people and interests and concerns that we still see leading the conversation for the most part in media and politics in particular. It's been great to see more young people demanding much more from leaders in media and decision makers around the world on inclusion and climate justice, which again is critical. But for the most part, Scotland and the UK again emphasise that we're still here. It's still those same faces and interests and themes that are at the front of the bigger Scottish and UK climate conversation, while people of all ages from working class communities and less affluent backgrounds remain largely on the fringes, as Jimmy mentioned as well, through no fault of their own. So again, this is a problem. The crisis, the solutions that we design won't just affect the already concerned or represented. And if we want solutions to be fair, and if we want a base of mobilised people capable of shouting for bigger systemic change, then we really need to do better to get more of those currently excluded people into the conversation, at the table, and along for the ride. So how do we fix this? How do we get more people along for the ride or feeling like this is their fight to in turn make sure that the transition is as fair and prosperous as it can be for those communities? Well, a complete restructuring of the current social and economic system to address massive historic inequalities in power and wealth would be a really good start, but I don't suppose I need to tell a group of educators and trade unionists that. Short of an all-out revolution, though, which I do think you should still strongly consider, there are things that educators and trade unionists are uniquely placed to do to help bring more people from those underrepresented backgrounds into the fold to help realise that more equitable and prosperous transition that we ultimately need. And I say this as someone who also teaches Access undergraduate students and who is also a union member, albeit not EIS. I think as well, from this perspective, it's especially important for us here since we're dealing a lot of the time with young people who are progressively more mobilised, anxious and angry about the scale of the climate emergency too, right? I'm not sure if this is controversial to say or not, but I think that as people working in education, fighting the climate crisis falls well within our duty of care remit for young people whose mental and physical well-being and whose future on this planet are being put increasingly at risk by a climate crisis driven by a broken, unequal economic system. As educators, challenging all of this in the ways that Jimmy and Stephen talked about as well has to be our responsibility too. Now, I want to caveat all of that, the revolution speak, by saying that I really do appreciate that education staff are under immense pressures already, right? And far be it from me to tell anyone or anyone's union how to work or organise. You know your colleagues, your classrooms, your communities better than I ever could. Your union is yours to do with it what you will. Only you'll know what's best for your own situation, right? But there are some fundamental principles I think that we can implement to help support a more inclusive and a more prosperous transition with those excluded voices firmly at the centre of things, and to help more effectively combat the climate crisis fairly from within our communities and spaces. Most fundamentally then, number one that we can all do, and I'm sure lots of you do already, is we can keep campaigning and fighting social and economic inequalities at every level of not just education, but wider society too. Those massive inequalities that are rooted in our current social, economic and political systems underpin the climate crisis as well. They are fundamentally inseparable from the issues that we have in terms of who experiences climate impacts, who gets to participate in setting the agenda, or who gets to design or benefit from the solutions that we need to implement. So redressing these historic injustices is critical to combating the climate emergency in a fair way going forward for people around the world, but also in our towns, our cities, and our communities as well. Now, obviously, this is very much an ongoing sort of strategy, and there's lots of work happening to try and address these inequalities already in lots of different spaces and campaigns. In fact, you know who, and Stephen will have a lot of experience of this, but you know who is shouting about this stuff most loudly just now, about fairness, about justice, about a different future for the planet and for those kinds of communities, is young people. Lots of us in this capacity are dealing with young people. Some of us still technically are young people who are very, very fired up about this stuff every single day, right? So listening to, amplifying and supporting the ones who are already engaged is a really important start for us as people who work with them. But what can we do then? Thinking more practically, what can we do now for those who aren't already active and shouting about it? How can we get people more involved with climate and use our positions to amplify and encourage those underrepresented voices today? Well, there are a few practical things that I think we can do on this in the here and now. One thing that I think we can all do as educators, but also as individuals, is to make climate more relevant to the people and communities around us. And we have an issue mobilising people, especially in less affluent communities, and in my experience in particular, because we only really get to hear the same kind of voices talk about how to make electric vehicles and heat pumps more affordable to purchase, in the mainstream conversation at least, rather than the wider social implications, the opportunities for change, the just transition, or how climate affects us and our lives more directly as well, making it real. So whether that's the kids that you teach or your colleagues, members of the local community, we are extremely well placed to make climate feel more directly relevant by having regular, empathetic, open and casual conversations about it, and by relating those climate issues to everyday experience and issues in our communities. Now, that can take a few different forms, right? It might be bringing local everyday issues into the climate things that we teach, or hosting events for people in the local community to come and talk and learn about climate in like a safe, relaxed kind of space with people that they know. From similar initiatives, just I should say from experience in things like Glasgow Community Energy and the kind of green spaces we try to support around that, this can have a much wider impact too, right? So it's not just about climate or setting up a community garden to do green type stuff. Actively bringing people into a local social safe space to talk about things can be a really powerful way to build social connection and solidarity in general, and bring people into conversations who you might not expect. From that foundation, we're much better placed to mobilise a bigger movement. So there are lots of ways that we can start to make climate real, local and personal to those kids, the communities, the people that we work with. None of this maybe sounds all that big or grand or sexy, but I maintain that these small social foundations are essential to a much more inclusive transition overall, to making people feel like the transition has relevance to them, particularly in areas of higher deprivation. And as educators especially, I think few people can relate climate issues to your community like you can. Nobody knows how to bring people, young or otherwise, into the fold like you are sort of trained to do. That authenticity, that experience, that local connection, I think is a really, really powerful tool. On the back of that, we can then start to connect climate to those wider social and economic opportunities. We can start to open up education beyond that as well. And again, with our own communities and the communities or institutions that we're working with in mind. So whether that's pitching community energy for you, for your school, which you should totally all do, it's an amazing thing, or whether that's the opportunities for better housing, jobs, streets, green space, transport, whatever it is that might be relative to your area. In my experience, this can be an especially powerful lightning rod to get people into climate in general and to open up into that bigger climate and climate justice conversation. So these are things that we can do very practically as educators with the communities and people that we work with, getting people involved in the first place, given that foundation so that we can then support them and amplify them to lead and be heard in the wider conversation, help capitalise on the bigger opportunity for justice, for prosperity, and for those bigger changes across the board. As trade unionists, and I think the other guys are better placed to talk on this than I am, but I'll close on this, just a couple of wee things that I think as trade unionists that we can do here. So again, without telling anyone how to organise, it's not my place to do so. I think trade unions have a critical role to play in combating the climate crisis in a fair way. And I think Stephen did an especially good job of setting this out as well. But as vehicles for big collective action with strong ties to those underrepresented communities and a voice to government in Scotland on the other side, trade unions can help to influence change in multiple spheres with ourselves, but also with those communities and the people that we work with firmly in mind. And this speaks to what we said about duty of care and responsibility before as well. So within a trade union in general, accepting that lots of unions are far from perfect, you have your internal politics, you have issues with power dynamics as well, and there's things that we have to iron out there. But within a union in general, I think we have a massive opportunity, not just to push for better conditions or for things around the workplace, which obviously should be the baseline, the priority, or even to push for climate action in the form of things like divestment or increased accountability, but to represent those communities and amplify people from those communities within our organisations to push for that fairer society from within that bigger collective vehicle and within the wider trade union landscape as well. So we have collective influence within trade unions that too many underrepresented communities don't currently have in this bigger climate conversation. We have ties across civic society. We have a rich history of collaboration, solidarity across the wider trade union movement in Scotland that we can utilise to demand better. We also, like we said before, as educators, have a duty to the young people we work with. So with some vision and determination, I think we can leverage this to push for that fairer, greener future, to agitate for the key social and economic changes that we need, and crucially to help represent our communities and young people and shout for a more inclusive, large-scale, equitable, rapid and prosperous transition overall. I'll end here because I'm aware that time is almost up and most of you have probably had enough of me telling you to suck eggs. But what I think we need more of, final point, what I think we need more than anything to secure that bigger and fairer future is to get more people, young or otherwise, from those backgrounds into that climate conversation and into positions of power and positions of influence to make sure they aren't left behind in the process, but also to create that broad base of people that we need to really make big, big change happen. People from backgrounds like mine and plenty more across the country and around the world to use our positions as educators and trade unionists to support that wherever we can. That starts with those little conversations. It starts with making climate and those opportunities and issues relevant and open and inclusive to everyone. And it starts with challenging social, educational and economic inequalities wherever we find them, and with supporting people across the board to feel like climate is their fight, because it is, it ultimately has to be. As people with a responsibility, especially to those young people that we teach and care for, I think it has to be ours as well. Thank you very much for bearing with me through the tech difficulties, for listening as well. And yeah, I look forward to chatting.
Thanks very much for that, Fraser. That was fantastic. And thanks for the wee warning about the wee odd colourful wee bit that was in there as well. I think we're all fine with that. But your whole speech was engaging, it was thought-provoking, it was wide-ranging, and I know from our point of view, you've given trade unions an awful lot to think about, so thank you so much. And I want to say thanks again to all three of our speakers. You all have given us a whole lot to think about. A lot of what you've said is very concerning, but there's optimism in there going forward for us as well. We've still got a few minutes before the end of our session. So we'll take some questions for our panelists. If you haven't already thought of something and you've suddenly just thought of a question you'd like to ask anyone, then please, you've got time just to type them into the chat box. While you're typing, again, I want to say thank you so much to all our speakers who have given up their time to join us, tonight, and also to all of you for giving up your valuable time and coming along. Can I just remind you that we have 3 further climate change webinars, 6th of October, 27th of October and 3rd of November, and you'll find out more about these events at www.eis.org.uk/climate change. And I'm going to ask now a couple of questions that have come in for us, and I'm not going to say who has to answer them. I'm going to let you fight out amongst yourselves who wants to answer it. So first question, what one single thing should we be pressing the Scottish Government to do to support climate justice? So just one thing. Anyone? It's a difficult question, isn't it?
Like I'm stealing Fraser's answer here, but it's got to be involving people that haven't been involved before in this agenda, in this work, making it real to them. Those are the people that are going to suffer most from this if we don't see this change. Those are the people that are going to be voting. These make up the bulk of our population. These vote, and we need to find much better ways to involve these people, and that needs to be creativity embraced as well. We need to think not just in terms of staring, again, going back to the care review, I spoke about this in my presentation, not just staring into the whites of the eyes of someone across the table, but in what ways do communities want to engage in this agenda? Is it through arts festivals? Is it through community hall meetings? Is it sitting outside and having a chat over a coffee? We need to make sure that power is rebalanced in how we're having these discussions, meeting people on their terms and enabling them to share what they want to share. And if we're not doing that, then again, that power dynamic is too inherent and we're not going to get people involved. Sorry, Stephen, you're unmuted at the same time.
That's all right, Jim. Yeah, it's difficult to think of just one thing. There's a whole list of things, I suppose. But one of the things which, one of the things they decided just recently not to do was to set up a public energy company, which is something which Unison in particular advocated for some time, in particular in relation to municipal energy companies. They talked about a public energy company which was more about buying cheap on the market and being able to sell it, which was a model which has been crashing all around us, and that wasn't the kind of model that we talked about. We talked about a public energy company which would be about generating electricity power. Fraser talked about community energy in Glasgow. You know, as my background's in local government, and I'm conscious in local government, we've got lots of roofs. Every school should have the solar panels that Fraser described. Some of them do. I mean, South Lanarkshire rebuilt all their schools actually, and latterly they started putting solar panels on and realised there was benefits from that. But it's not just about what we could do now, but every council house could have solar panels. In fact, if you actually started a programme to put solar panels in all the council houses, then you wouldn't stop at just the council house. You would then engage with the people who've bought their council house, the private homeowners and the private estates as well, because on this economies of scale, you would be able to solarise, I like that word, solarise all the roofs in a town and generate electricity, which wouldn't just be for the householders' benefit, it would be for the community benefit, because that could then help to fund or help to power the residential care homes, for example, or the youth clubs or the day centres. The Scottish Government, in my opinion, made a big mistake by saying, no, we're not going to do that. That's one project that they could do. They could harness the power of local authorities, the land that local authorities still use, and engage with the community. And it's the point that Fraser and Jimmy, I think, are both making. That then means we're saying to people, not just this about saving the world and climate change and all this, it's about reducing poverty, because we could then generate electricity almost for free in reality. So we could deal with fuel poverty in Scotland by, in a course of 10 to 15 years, you could see real change if the Scottish Government committed to that kind of project. So that would be my one big ambition for the Scottish Government. I've got several others, but I'll stick at that one at the moment.
Thanks for that. The questions are coming in thick and fast now. So the next question I'm going to take is from Alan Crosby. It says, how do we best respond to the right wing's co-option of the green agenda? Who'd like to take that one?
Well, demonstrated. But we at Wheel Scotland, we've also seen some co-option of the term wellbeing economy, and it's concerning. And I think our approach is to always talk about the principles that underpin what it is. And if people are co-opting and using that term on any part of the political spectrum, call it out, but also be proactive with it as well. So offer to be there, offer to meet, offer to engage with people to build those relationships before you get to a point of people using and co-opting that term. So be proactive, be reactive, and focus on the principles that underpin it. That's our approach. Not easy though.
Thanks for that, Jim. Another one here, and this is for Fraser. Do you know if there are any community energy projects in Fife, like the Glasgow Community Energy Co-op you spoke of?
Yes, there are. So Leave and Mouth are getting one together just now. That's in part, I think they've got a big industrial partner that are supporting them to do it. And this is kind of what's popping up around the country as well, is whether that's energy suppliers or a little bit more local governments, but still not on the scale that would like, certainly, like Stephen was talking about. But these bigger partnerships are coming together to get community energy projects off the ground. The one that we have in Glasgow is it's a cooperative. There are a few cooperatives around the country, but actually not a huge amount of them working in energy. So there's a big Edinburgh solar cooperative, not Fife obviously, but big Edinburgh solar cooperative who have solar panels on roofs of dozens of schools at this point, school leisure centres, that kind of stuff as well. But that's all come through share funding. That's all been money that's been crowdsourced effectively into this cooperative model. So there are kind of different ways that community energy is popping up. There are a few of them popping up in Fife, but Leave and Mouth is the one that I would point you towards just now. But have a look into some of the other ones too, because just about any of the models that you're seeing coming up, a lot of them are quite innovative, whether that's around social housing, whether that's around community centres and things like that. Have a look around Community Energy Scotland's website. They have an interactive map of all the different projects that you have, and you can just open it up and see exactly what they're doing there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Fraser. And I think we've got time for one last question. So this mentions trade unions, so I'm going to ask this one. With respect to trade unions, do you see a default position where government policy may actually harm polluting industries and the roles associated in the short term, but will have a positive change in the long term?
Maybe I should take that one. The real danger. I mean, if you think about renewables, so everywhere you go, on every hill, there's a wind turbine, and that's a great thing. And I remember the debates. I'm old enough, I'm not one of those young people in the future. I'm old enough to remember the life before we had wind turbines, and it was quite controversial. Who the hell wants one of those things popping up and spoiling the view? Now we've got them everywhere, and I think they're generally a good thing. The problem is that they're all owned by most of them are owned by foreign companies. So the benefits of that push to be the Saudi Arabia of renewables is that, I think it was Alex Salmond that coined that phrase, has been, we are generating. These private companies are owned sometimes by state-owned energy companies abroad, are generating lots of renewable electricity, but the benefits are not coming down to the community. We've not created jobs. So the jobs we've lost in the gas sector or the oil sector have not been replaced by good jobs within the renewable sector, and that's one of the faults in the government. And primarily, it's a UK government, I have to say, policy. It's a reserved matter in terms of energy policy. Scottish Government could do more, obviously, and that's why the unions have been raising quite hard in recent years that the whole supply chain issue. So you'll be aware of the BIFAB controversy, where we had yards who could build these turbines, but instead were shipping them from Indonesia on big oil-driven tankers, creating all the pollution and all the rest of it. So yes, that's an example of a government policy which not only harms existing industries, if you like, or starts to replace existing industries, but doesn't actually bring benefits. And if it continues along that ownership model, then I'm afraid, you know, even in the long term, there might not be significant positive change. We might not be polluting as much, but we're not creating jobs. And we do have to transition in that way to create jobs. So I think that's one of the concerns we've got. So we do need to look at how we make this transition in a way which does have the positive changes. And current government policy doesn't have that kind of industrial strategy in place.
Thanks for that, Stephen. So I'd like to thank again Jimmy, Stephen and Fraser for joining us, and for everyone at home who's been joining us. We've been tweeting and a number of people have watched on the webinar on Facebook. This event's been recorded and we'll upload it to our YouTube page in the coming days. And finally, please do check out our webpage, www.eis.org.uk/climate change, where details of our forthcoming climate change webinars are listed, and where you can find out more about details regarding our online exhibition of pupils' work on climate change and call for climate change education themed teaching materials. And with that, I'd like to wish you all a very good night and thank you once again. Good night, everybody.